All right. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, whenever I'm catching you. This is the Hobbit Chapter 1, Part 2, where we had left off. Our little Hobbit Bilbo was hanging out in his garden, and a strange wizard walked up and asked him on an adventure. And remember, hobbits don't really like adventures, so he kind of shooed him away. And Bilbo thought he got out of it, but let's see what happens. The next day, Bilbo had almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well, unless he wrote them down on his engagement tablet, like this. Gandalf T. Wednesday. Yesterday, he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Flustered is when you're kind of like taken, like something comes out of left field and kind of messes with your head. Just before tea time, there came a tremendous ring on the front doorbell, and then he remembered. He rushed and he put on the kettle, and he grabbed another cup and another saucer and an extra cake or two and ran to the door. "I'm sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into his golden belt, and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed right inside, just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg, and "Dwalin, at your service," he said, with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. And when the silence that followed had become awkward, he asked, "I'm just about to take tea. Pray that you come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he had meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation? They had not been at the table long. In fact, they had hardly reached their third cake when there came another, even louder ring at the door. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went through the door. "So you've got here at last." That's what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it wasn't Gandalf. Instead, it was a very old-looking dwarf on the step, with a white beard and a scarlet hood. He, too, hopped inside just as soon as the door was open, just as if he had been invited. "I see they've begun to arrive already," he said, when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it. And "Balin, at your service," he said, with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had caught him off guard. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them to come over himself. And then he had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, being the host, would have to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better if it's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with the white beard. "But I don't mind some cake, seed cake, if you have any." "Lots," Bilbo found himself answering, to his own surprise. He found himself scuttling off, to the cellar, to fill a pint beer mug, and then to the pantry, to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper snack. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, when a loud ring came at the bell again, and then another. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought, as he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all at this point. "What can I do for you, my dwarves?" he said. "Keely at your service," said one, and "Feely," added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your family's," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin are here already, I see," said Keely. "Let us join the throng." Throng is a word for a group of people. "Throng," thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just had a sip over in the corner, while the 4 dwarves sat around the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand, and he did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous. When ding, 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 his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some 4, I should say, by the sound," said Feely. "Besides, we saw them coming behind us off in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands, and he wondered what had happened, and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay till supper. Then the bell rang again, louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods, 1 grey hood, A brown hood and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, some called for porter, one called for coffee, and all of them called for cakes. So the hobbit was very busy. A big jug of coffee had been set in the hearth, the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were starting on a round of scones, when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-a-tat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging on it with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry and altogether bewildered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he had ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of another. More dwarves, 4 more. And there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent on Bilbo's beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there the morning before. Carefully, carefully, he said. It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep your friends waiting on the mat, and then open the door like a gun. Let me introduce Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, and especially Thorin. At your service, said Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with long silver tassels. The last one belonged to Thorin. He was an enormously important dwarf. In fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat, with Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur on top of him. For one thing, Bombur was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin, indeed, was very haughty, and he said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Don't mention him," and he stopped frowning. Now we're all here, said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for us latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. I'll have a little red wine, I think. And red wine for me too, said Thorin. And raspberry jam and apple tart, said Bifur. And mince pies and cheese, said Bofur. And pork pie and salad, said Bombur. And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind, called the other dwarves through the door. Put on a few eggs while you're at it, Gandalf called after him, and the hobbits stumped off to the pantries. And just bring out bring out the cold chicken and pickles. Seems that they know just about as much as about the inside of my pantry as I do myself, thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed. Flummoxed is confused, overwhelmed, a little frustrated, and he was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had gotten all of the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on trays, he was getting very hot, very red in the face, and quite annoyed. Confiscate and bother these dwarves, he said aloud. Why don't they come and lend a hand? Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of his kitchen, Feely and Keely behind them. And before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and to the couple of small tables in the parlor and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all around, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling on a biscuit, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure. The dwarves ate, and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. I suppose you will all stay to supper, he said in his politest, unpressing tones. Of course, said Thorin, and after. We shan't get through business till late, and we must have some music first. Now let's clean up. Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin though, he was too important, jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on top with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, squealing with fright. Please be careful. Please don't trouble, I can manage. But the dwarves only started to sing. Chip the glasses, crack the plates, bend the knives and blunt the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles, burn the corks, cut the cloth and tread the fats, pour the milk out on the pantry floor, leave the bones on the bedroom mat, splash the wine on every door, dump the crocks in a boiling bowl, pound them up with a thumping pole, and when you've finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, so carefully with the plates. And of course they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleaned and put away safe and quick as lightning. While the hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing, They went back and found Thorin with his feet on the table, smoking a pipe. He was blowing out the most enormous smoke rings, and wherever he told one to go, it went, up the chimney, or behind the clock on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! Gandalf would send a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe, straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back and hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud about his head already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings, and then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent over the hill. Alright, so Bilbo has a bunch of unexpected visitors. He thought Gandalf was coming over, and there's 13 dwarves and Gandalf. So we're going to leave it there for this one, and we'll pick it up again soon.